Welcome. My name is Patrick Curran, and along with my survivalist friend Greg Hancock, we make up Quantitude. We are a podcast dedicated to all things quantitative, ranging from the relevant to the completely irrelevant. In this week's episode, Greg and I explore the incredibly cool topic of survival analysis. This is a set of techniques that allows for powerful tests of predictors of the amount of time to experiencing an event, yet these models are not often used in many areas of study. Along the way, we also discuss the date of your death, running with scissors, my Audi A8, because she's dead, say my name, the good guys, things that annoy me, you tell me, using your brain, sofa forts, backdating checks, logistic regression on steroids, and coming to the party late. We hope you enjoy this week's episode.
I am holding an envelope right here in my hand. Inside this envelope is the date that you're going to die.
Because you've arranged it?
No, 2 phone calls. I know a guy.
What the hell, dude? Is this a threat?
No, I had people who know you write down the date they wish you would die, and I just took one from those.
Well, that was 1993. Okay, is there a point to this other than just an abject public threat?
Imagine I have the date of your death inside this envelope. Would you want me to open this envelope?
Oh, I am torn. Because my very first reaction is absolutely not. Carpe diem, live every day like it's your last, blah, blah, blah. All the usual stuff. That's 80% of me.
Okay.
20% yes. Because I'm going to start opening doors mid-flight on Southwest airplanes. I'm going to quit wearing a seatbelt.
Woohoo!
I'm just going to push the limit on everything.
Go out in a blaze of recklessness.
Actually, though, does it also say in there, would I have a permanent feeding tube at the time of my death? Because riding without a seatbelt doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to die.
That's right.
But it could change the quality of my life substantially. I'm going to go take it all back, and I'm going to go with a hard no.
Okay.
How about you? I'm holding an envelope. I didn't even have an envelope. I have written on the palm of my hand. Would you want to know?
I 100% would not want to know, which is unusual for me because I like control. I like knowledge of things. And I really like your idea of this period of recklessness where it's like, I'm going to run with scissors every day until then.
I mean, seriously, how fun would that be? You're in kind of a scary situation and you knew that you were going to be just fine. You would never be afraid of turbulence on an airplane again. Right. You would never be afraid of anything. I love that. Although I have to say, even with the 100% hard no, if I were to know, I might buy my Audi A8.
Oh.
That I've been putting off because I'm saving for retirement. My dream car is this Audi A8, 5-speed turbocharged V8. It's an absolute monster, and I want one desperately. But if I don't buy it, I can retire 2 years earlier. And so I'm going to drive my 18-year-old Toyota Corolla because I'm in it for the long con. But if I knew that on that card that you have in the envelope was 2026, I'm buying that A8 this afternoon.
I'm just going to peek in there. His body was found in an Audi A8.
Oh, butterfly effect. You can. So the reason that I died was that I was going 180 miles an hour in my Audi A8. Oh, the complexity of life.
Yeah.
Could I take a little bit of a dark turn?
Like this wasn't it? Sure.
Okay, could I take a little bit of a darker turn?
Oh, please.
My mom moved to a senior care facility or senior community. I think that's what they called it, a senior community. My mom was like, I am done. I am done shoveling snow. I am done buying my own groceries. She was very happy to move into this nursing home. It was 3 stages. There was the independent living community that was totally cool. It was just an apartment that was within the facility. And then there was a higher level of care. And then there was kind of a critical care that was almost like an emergency room, ICU kind of thing. My mom went to walk around and my brother and I were meeting with the woman who was super professional, super great. The woman said, our data shows that on average, a resident will live in independent living for 7 years. They will live in stepped-up care for 12 months, and then they will either move to the high-level facility for a month, or they will no longer need our services. And there was a pause, and my brother looked at her and said, "Because she's dead." The woman squirmed, and she said, "Well, it's just that after those time periods, her contractual obligations will be filled." And I looked at my brother and I said, "Because she's dead." And the woman said, no. It's just she will no longer need our services. And we both look at each other and at the same time said, "Because she's dead." And it became this bizarre thing on principle, right? Anybody who's watching Breaking Bad, and there's this very famous scene.
"Say my name. Heisenberg. You're goddamn right."
We just wanted to hear her say, "Because she's dead."
Yes, okay, because she's dead.
And she never gave in. But you know what is really wild? Almost to the month, they were right in their projections. It was 7 years within a month, and it was 12 months within a month until she was no longer in need of their services.
We had the same thing with my dad when he was cared for at home. People came in-home hospice would come in and just check on him while we were taking care of him. And my brother absolutely did the lion's share of this. I would think, oh yeah, he's doing okay. The problem is that I thought of everything linearly. And they knew that this is a very non-linear process, right? This picks up speed later on. And I just really didn't appreciate that. And again, they were just down to nearly the week, knowing that trajectory, right? Of when Dad would no longer need our services.
But what's interesting is going back to these expected time horizons on the care facility, they had empirically informed predictions of how this would play out for the typical person. Now, obviously, there's individual variability around that, but everything we do in statistics is talking about, well, what is the average? Does the average depend on other variables that we have in the model? The entire linear model, all we're doing is sliding a conditional mean up and down a line. I was pretty impressed that they were able to have that degree of precision to identify when my mother would no longer be in need of their services. Because, say it with me, because she's dead.
Yeah.
But it brings us to, why do we not use these kinds of models more in the social and behavioral sciences?
It's a great question, right? Models for understanding how long it takes for something to occur, not just death, but other events too, are very, very common in health sciences, epidemiological sciences, a lot of other areas. And it's just not something that we tend to use here in the social sciences or psychology or education. And damn it, we absolutely should avail ourselves of these techniques.
There are a class of remarkable analytic methods that have been around for decades and decades, and broadly, they are called survival analysis. They go by a lot of different names and different subdisciplines, and again, we just do that to confuse you. Two of my heroes in the field, and I will read any paper they've ever written, are John Willett and Judy Singer.
Oh yeah, for sure.
They are not only remarkable academicians, but I know John peripherally. He and I have talked a few times. I don't know him well. I've not had the honor of meeting Judy, but everything I've heard about both of them is they're the good guys. In our field, there are people who are in it for the right reasons, and they are in it for the right reasons.
In that spirit, I gave a talk at a conference one time. They were in the audience. I knew they were in the audience, and it made me a little bit nervous because I was talking about longitudinal models. I was a very young faculty member. After the talk, they both came up and they said, "We just want you to know we really like what you're doing, and we hope you keep doing it." To this day, I can feel how important that was to me inside. Those are the kinds of people that we need in our field.
And especially in this day and age where there's a lot of angst and frustration around academia, getting into academia, staying in academia, it takes so little effort to walk up after a talk and say something like that. But a lot of people, even if they feel that way, just walk out with the crowd and say, "Oh, that was nice." Do you know where they get a pass in my book of things things that annoy me. I realize this is a multi-volume set of things that annoy me, and I have an entire volume dedicated just to you.
Oh, okay.
I have a really low tolerance for cutesy titles for papers. They get a pass on it because they have the best titles. One is Modeling the Days of Our Lives. One is From Whether to When. One is It's Deja Vu All Over Again. I love the titles to their papers. They have a paper in Psychological Bulletin, which was before the birth of psych methods, that wanted to bring survival analysis to the masses in psychology.
Yeah.
And it is one of the most beautifully written, most clear, most on-point paper, and it was written in 1991.
Yeah.
Now, everyone listening, I want you to go back in the Wayback Machine and put you in wherever you were in 1991. Which for a large proportion of listeners, you were a glint in your parents' eyes in 1991. It is vexing how much material has been written to try to do this and how universally it's failed.
Yeah.
I don't have a formal lit review in front of me, but rarely, if ever, do you see really well done survival analysis models in the psychological sciences. Of course, they're out there, but they are few and far between.
First of all, I like the irony of the guy who used space elevators in the title of a paper.
Oh, things that annoy me don't apply to myself.
Okay.
Dude, how long have you known me?
Yeah, it's true. Obviously, the social sciences have a deep interest in time, understanding processes that are wedded to time, change over time, all of those kinds of things, right? Multi-level models have a whole segment of them that represent change over time. Latent growth curve models, obviously wedded to time. But the actual modeling of how long it takes for something to occur just seems to completely escape us as a technique.
And it is such a beautiful question to ask. How long does it take for an event to occur, and can we predict it by characteristics that we have on the individual? So take my mom going into the care facility. On the first day of admission, what is the probability that you are going to survive in the nursing home? It is 1.0 on that very first day, unless you have a tragic accident in the parking lot. When time starts, which is your first day in the care facility, your probability of surviving is 1.0. Now, as every day, week, month, year passes, that probability changes. We can think about, over a given period of time, what is your probability of surviving, right? That's where a lot of these techniques came out originally, was out of the biostatistics literature and medical literature, is predicting survival, whether it be post-surgical intervention, whether it be post anything that's a starting of time. As soon as we start getting our head around the probability of an event occurring that is linked to time, this opens the gates on an amazing array of questions that we can ask. What is the median time of survival? So how long must pass before there's a 50-50 chance that you're going to hit whatever the event is? All right, so survival is just originally moving from 0 to 1 on alive versus dead, right? We're trying to predict time to death. As soon as we get our head around the notion of has an event occurred or not, and if it did, when did it occur? That opens up a universe of questions that we can ask that we are unable to in our usual day-to-day statistical models.
The word survival carries kind of a negative framing. Not everything that we do has to be framed as surviving, literally.
Because she's dead.
She no longer needs our services.
You're goddamn right.
And so that's why it's sometimes called time-to-event analysis, which is a kinder, gentler way of saying
That is, she no longer needs our services. You could
completely
call
that.
this entire class of models, your mother will no longer need our services. I am proposing that becomes the new umbrella term for time-to-event modeling.
And that's what it needs to break into the social sciences, I think. That's exactly it. We ran a your mom no longer needs our services analysis on these data. I live in a world that is predominantly education driven, and I can think of a couple of things. You could imagine, for example, brand new teachers who go into the profession, and a very reasonable question is how long they stay in the teaching profession, right? So someone might stay 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Someone might continue on for their entire career. Who knows? But modeling how long someone stays in a profession, very useful thing to know, especially in a world that is always needing to have a sense of how many teachers are there available, how many do we anticipate, how many students are coming down the line. Those kinds of models would be incredibly useful. Imagine we have kids who have received some behavioral intervention, right? So you have a number of kids who are identified as behaviorally at risk, and you give them some sort of cognitive behavioral strategy to monitor their own behavior. And then you look at how much time until whether they have to go to detention or they get referred to the principal's office for something. You can model the time until these events. These are things we absolutely want to do, but we don't do them.
And I think this is particularly salient within my area of study, which is the substance use literature.
Oh, yeah.
The standard kind of study, you go in at time one and you get adolescents who are maybe 11 to 15, and then you follow them every 6 months over a 3-year period. And then we do this whole class of wonderful growth models where in any given assessment period, we ask a kid, well, how much have you drank in the last 30 days or in the last 60 days, or a bunch of different ways we can measure this. And we model trajectories of substance use. And we fit an intercept and we fit a slope and we predict intercept and we predict slope. And that's all really, really good. I'm not bad-mouthing any of that. However, we're mixing a few things. One is the intercept, we start talking about predictors of the start of the curve, initial status. And some people even get careless and say onset. Well, it's not at all. If you're looking at 12, 13, 14-year-olds, the whole developmental process, things started before you ever recruited them into your study, and things are chugging along. And if they're already drinking at age 15, you have no idea, did they start the week before? Did they start at age 14, 13, 12, 11? You have no idea. We have to be very, very careful about talking about initial status of a process that's already going on, but there is some really well-developed theory that talks about what are risk and protective factors that are associated with the onset of alcohol use. All right. And if you go in and get 11 to 15-year-olds and just say, how many drinks have you had in the last 30 days? You are not asking an onset question.
Right.
You are asking a level question, a use question, a daily use or a weekly use question. There are two really important things. One is, what are risk and protective factors that are associated with age of onset of substance use? So if somebody starts at age 11 versus 12 versus 13, can we predict when that age of onset is going to be to understand the developmental process? Part two to that is there's research that indicates that it is beneficial if we can delay the age of onset in adolescence to a later time. Because statistically speaking, substance use is normative, meaning that the typical adolescent experiments with alcohol and drug use, and whether they go into regular use or problem use is a different question, but that there are developmental benefits to delaying the onset. So instead of a kid becoming drunk for the first time at age 12, can an intervention program delay that to age 15 or age 16? Because that is a beneficial effect. Well, we have to understand what those risk and protective factors are. And to do that, we've got to design a study where we have a sample of kids, none of whom have started drinking yet, and then follow them over time and say, how about now? How about now? How about now? How about now? Ooh, this kid went from a 0 to a 1, and we do that for the entire sample, and that brings us to the survival analysis kinds of modeling and questions.
Okay, so before worrying about risk and protective factors, before worrying about interventions, we just have to know what the course of this particular behavior is. And when do we start that? What's a good starting time for the study that you describe?
You tell me, Greg. This is the fort made out of sofa cushions that every quantitative person hides inside, which is, well, Greg, that's a theoretical question. You need to tell me. If any statistical consultant ever tells you that, that means they don't know the answer to your question. But what it is, well, it depends. Because substance use, I think, is a really interesting example because every person born, when they exit the mother in whatever way they exit and are held by the nurse, has not started drinking alcohol at that moment. So there are some things that there's a natural 0 point. But there are a lot of things where we got to kind of figure out. Say that somebody is coming out of a treatment program for substance use and you want to predict recidivism. Well, there may be age heterogeneity in the chronological age of the individuals, but everybody has a 0 point of the day they completed treatment. So that 0 point can vary wildly by theory and design.
But I would guess you're going to have to define what you mean by age of first use. I grew up in a family that had a very heavy, I'll just say, European presence. And what that means is that at dinner at my grandmother's, it was not at all uncommon for an 11-year-old to have a glass of wine with everybody else at the meal. Does that mean that I was drinking early on? So how do we define the event in this particular case?
This is one of the many reasons why I love survival analysis is you have to think about what do I mean by the start of time? What do I mean by what I code as an event? It makes us work in a way that sometimes we don't. In some settings, the outcome is unambiguously moving from 0 to 1. So whether it be death, you are alive or you are not alive, you need our services or you no longer need our services, or divorce or age at first marriage or age at the birth of your first child, they're discrete, observable, pretty easy to define. A lot of outcomes, though, that are of interest to us in the behavioral sciences are less so. In substance use, it's pretty typical to not have a sip of wine. So an item is, how old were you when you had more than a sip of alcohol? And so we try to protect against things like sacramental wine in church, which was my upbringing as in a Catholic church, or a little bit of wine at the table, or your parent lets you taste it. So you have to have very clear measurement. Sometimes people will say, when was the first time you had a full drink of alcohol? And they define it, a shot of distilled spirits, a 6-ounce glass of wine, or a 12-ounce beer. You know, the ones I like is because there's huge individual variability in how you metabolize ethanol and the affective impact that alcohol has. All right, so I'm a 183-pound man. My daughter going off to college is a 120-pound inexperienced drinker. The glass of wine for her is fundamentally different than a glass of wine for me. So what some people will say, the event is the first time you were drunk. But even that is like, well, what do you mean by that? But your point is really well taken. We have to unambiguously identify an event, and there may be some subjectivity in that. And my response is, yeah, deal with it.
Imagine that we have dealt with it, that we've defined it in a way as clearly as we can. We have a starting time, which might be birth and what you're talking about. We also are going to have some ending time. If we were trying to understand about the onset of alcohol use, and maybe we define it as the first time you were drunk, when does that study end? Does it end at age 19? What's the window that you choose to be able to study this?
Well, Greg, that's a theoretical question, and you need to tell me. I think you have to think about it developmentally. How long do you think you need to see an adequate expression of the event? We don't want it so short that only 10% of people show the event. Singer and Willett have a rule of thumb. The minimum time period is where at least half your sample has experienced the event. Total subjective, but defensible.
I would imagine it also depends on what it is you're studying, right? If you only care about up through the end of adolescence or up through school, then you might be studying something where fewer people reach event, right?
We do this all the time in research, which is we self-define something to backdate a check to justify a decision. I am interested in predictors of onset of alcohol use during high school. So the starting point is the first day of school and the end point is the graduation.
Yeah.
I self-define that's my time window. Now, that's a bit of a cop-out, but it is justification for why you quit gathering data once the child has graduated from high school.
At some point, you are going to define windows, and even that creates challenge, right? Because if you had defined your study at the start of high school, you might have some kids who have already started drinking. So that's a problem, because then you don't know about the age of onset except to say that it occurred before. And then you will have some kids who won't experience getting drunk in that particular time window, and that could be true even if you started it at birth and went all the way up to, let's say, 18. So the idea of what's called censoring is very fundamental to the study of survival. In the case of the nursing home, I think pretty much everybody is going to reach criterion. But other things that we study, we absolutely will experience what's sometimes called right censoring. People don't reach whatever the criterion is that we have. And that's interesting in and of itself.
So what Greg is saying is, let's imagine we follow over some period of time. Let's just simplify and say at the initial period, no one has experienced the event. Mm-hmm. And at the final time period, when we're done, maybe 70% of the sample experienced the event and 30% didn't. Here's the thing. In that 30%, it doesn't mean that they won't experience the event. It just means that we didn't observe it. We can't treat those zeros as the same. And that's what Greg is talking about, right censoring. The right and left is with respect to time. It isn't that they didn't experience the event. We just didn't observe it. So we can't treat those as zeros that are equitable. We got to somehow build that censoring into the model. In my opinion, that was one of the real challenges the field struggled with for a lot of years.
So it goes without saying that there's a lot of technical stuff that goes on under the hood for the kinds of analyses that we're talking about, or dancing around maybe. We have no intention of making this episode a deep dive into survival analysis. What we really want to do is raise this as a possibility so that people become aware of this and say, oh, that might be something that I actually want to do. So rather than go really deeply into it, what I'd like to do is just talk about some of the major methodological mile markers along the way that people think about in survival analysis, essentially doing what we like to do, open doors for people to choose to go in later if they decide that they need that.
I love the way you describe that because it implies that you and I would be capable of doing a deep dive into modern survival analysis. So yeah, I could explain this to you, but for your benefit, we're going to keep the conversation at 30,000 feet. Yes, absolutely. There is a remarkable literature out there. New general rule for the day is if Judy Singer and or John Willett has written something, go read it.
For sure.
They have a textbook that I actually have open in front of me. It is called Applied Longitudinal Data Analysis by Singer and Willett, 2003. If you want one book on your shelf, have this one. It's a twofer. The first half is growth modeling, and the second half is survival analysis. It's 2 books in one.
Nice.
It is the most lucid, accessible, thorough book, I think, on my shelf, and it's right next to a book I wrote myself. So I can say this is better than my book. Let's keep it at 30,000 feet.
Okay.
And let's just take as a given that these models can be estimated.
Yeah.
Let's think instead about why it might be worth your while to learn about these for applications in your own work.
So something that you said earlier that I liked a lot, and that is that it all starts with just sort of a reckoning of how things work over time. That started back around 1958 with Kaplan and Meyer. So anybody who decides to open the door and go in and learn about survival analysis, it starts with what are called Kaplan-Meier curves. The Kaplan-Meier curve is so simple, so primitive. All it is a table. Think about this in the example that Patrick gave. We have some starting point, whether it's birth or some other starting point, where we have at that earliest time point, 100% of people have not reached criterion. If criterion is getting drunk, 100% of people have not done that. We click over to the next point. What percentage of the people have reached criterion now? And then you just go from left to right, clicking over time to time to time to time to time. And what you see is that as people have reached that criterion, whether it's use of alcohol or something else, this behaves like a little step function that works its way down all the way until everybody has reached criterion. In the alcohol example, everybody became drunk for the first time. But if the study stops at a particular point, you're not necessarily going to make it all the way down to there's nobody left. You might be left off with, oh, okay, there's still 30% of people who are alive at the end of the study. So this curve is just very, very simple. It's a table that just goes stepwise down, 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 down as there are fewer and fewer people left who haven't reached criterion. Boom. Very easy.
There are complications in estimation and inference and missing data, but the core of it are proportions.
That's it.
Sometimes these are called life tables. At time 1, how many people are in the cell? And nobody has had the event. Between time 1 and time 2, of those at time 1, how many experienced the event? Now you have a proportion of those who did, but the denominator of that is those who have not experienced the event. So then you move from time 2 to 3. That denominator is sometimes called the risk set or the risk pool. Those are still at risk who haven't had it. Of those, how many experience the event? And you just go along your merry way.
Yeah.
This is called a discrete time survival because we move from 1 to 2 to 2 to 3. We can generalize these models to what are called continuous time that are much like a growth model where we have a continuity, and what that means is you just have much more narrow time periods. We're not going to do a deep dive into that. It's easier to get our head around the discrete time. It is literally just in a time window of those who had not experienced the event, how many did?
It's a beautiful thing. It's a simple thing. And it's an absolutely necessary first step to understand what is the nature of the behavior that you're trying to study. Now I can look at this table and answer questions like, at what point have 50% of people reached criterion, tried alcohol to the point of intoxication, whatever it is? This is very descriptive. It's not unlike the growth charts that when we go to the pediatrician and they tell us where our kid is, it gives you a sense of what things look like over whatever the developmental trajectory is for that overall across individuals. So if I've articulated this general trajectory of people's substance use in this case, what are some things that you might be interested in knowing whether or not that depends on?
The first question is just, what is the curve for the entire sample? We can talk about as kind of an average.
Yep.
What does that look like? Where is peak risk? Is there a point that there's a highest risk that then goes down over time? Is that point in the middle? Is that point in the end? Is it more of a smooth function? So in teacher retention, we know that the highest period of risk for leaving the profession is in year 2 or 3.
Yeah.
After that, if you can make it through about year 2 or 3, then it's more and more likely that a teacher is going to stay. So I would want to know, where's the peak risk in onset of alcohol use? Is it at transition to high school? Is it when you get your driver's license at age 16? Is that the peak of risk? So we have this overall function describing risk of onset of behavior. But anytime we see a pooled summary, we can't help ourselves but have a hankering to say, I wonder if that differs as a characteristic of the kid.
Let me ask you, what's a good binary example of a characteristic that you might want to compare?
In my world, and what I did a lot of my early work on, was, does the adolescent's parent suffer from a substance use disorder or not? So imagine, just for simplicity, half the kids have a parent who does not have a substance use disorder. Half of the kids do have a parent who has a substance use disorder. And then the research question is, are adolescents at greater risk for onset, and not only onset of substance use, but early onset of substance use if their parent has a substance use disorder themselves?
What a great example, because you could imagine building one of these tables that we described, the Kaplan-Meier curve, for those whose parents had a substance use disorder versus those who didn't. The null hypothesis here at work is that those two curves are the same. They're identical to each other. In fact, if you took all of the data and just swirled them up and made one plot, And then you went for each time point and said, okay, at this age, how many kids do I have who tried alcohol, whose parents have a substance use disorder? How many kids whose parents don't tried alcohol? And you go through all of those time points. If there's no difference, you would expect to see a pretty even balance of kids at each time point from each of those groups. But what happens if there's a difference? Well, you're probably going to see more kids earlier in the table from one of those groups and more kids later in the table from one of the other groups. And so there's a very simple procedure called a log rank test that is nothing more than a variation on a chi-square test that just looks at, are the expected frequencies at the different time points the same across these groups, or are they different? But what a powerful question to be able to answer.
And it applies to any discrete grouping you can think of. What I described was observational, because of course we can't ethically assign a substance use disorder or not. But imagine that you were working with prisoners who were paroled and you wanted to try to minimize the probability of recidivism. Mm-hmm. And you randomly assign half to a group where they're just sent out into the community without any support, and half are assigned to a group where you have some kind of support intervention. And then you look at, does the support program significantly delay recidivism if you got the program versus not? So this scales up and down in any way that you would want. And as Greg is pointing out, these are perfectly logical. When you think about it, is instead of one life table where you say that all kids are equivalent, you functionally have one life table for adolescents who do not have a parent with a substance use disorder and a second for adolescents that do have a parent with a substance use disorder.
We could ask whether or not the trajectory depends on all kinds of variables, right? Continuous variables, group code kinds of variables, a whole mix of those. And that takes us into a world of what's sometimes called Cox regression, or I think its full name is Cox proportional hazard survival regression. But the idea of wanting to know whether or not the trajectory that you have in this table appears to depend on other characteristics seems like a very realistic thing to want to do.
Except you misnamed it. It's actually the Cox semi-parametric proportional hazard your mother will no longer need our services analysis.
Okay.
And I'm not being hyperbolic in saying this. It's a logistic regression on steroids. And this holds for like 80% of our field. Advanced statistical modeling is mostly data management. We're not going to get into the weeds on this, but what it is for those of you who are familiar with wide versus long format, this is what's called long format. Every person has a record of data at each time point. If I'm the adolescent and I have time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4, the first row is ID number 1. What is my biological sex? What is my parent characteristic? Did I drink or not? Yes or no? The second row is my time 2. And what this is it's kind of like, so did you drink now? How about now? How about now? How about now?
Right.
Every record records that. We can have the grouping variable as Greg describes, but we just shrug and say, well, what about a continuous measure? So in my neck of the woods, maybe it is a characteristic of the home in terms of environmental stress. And all we're saying is not only are we going to look at the conditional probability that you would have an onset of the event in a given time period, we're now going to build into that conditional statement along with information about X1, X2, X3, and X4. A really important word that Greg used was proportional hazards, which means that a characteristic of the individual is going to move that risk equitably across the time span. So it's proportional.
Right.
It's similar to other things that we have in proportionality and cumulative logistic models that we would do in other kinds of settings.
We have most of the skills to do this already as far as interpretation goes. You're going to get out a function with a number of coefficients, just like we do in logistic regression, and then it comes down to interpreting those coefficients. And what I know from my logistic regression, over there, I say things like, for a 1 unit increase in X, the logit increase, right? And then we have to go, okay, what the heck does that mean? We have something like that in the Cox regression model too, where we have these coefficients that are much easier to interpret by exponentiating them. So we go through something very much like what we do in logistic regression, where we get out coefficients, we exponentiate them, and then we say things like, for a 1 unit increase in X, some characteristic of the home, for example, what kind of increase is there or what kind of decrease is there in the chance that someone engages in drinking to intoxication or whatever the criterion is? All of the same skills that you have from logistic regression port over here when it comes to interpretation. There are many assumptions that underlie this as well, and one of them is sort of wedded in the name here, and that is a proportional hazards model.
The proportional hazards literally says that whatever the impact of that covariate is, it has an equitable impact on the risk over the time span. So you can think about if having a parent with a substance use disorder elevates your risk, it elevates your risk to the same magnitude between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 and 3 and 4. What that means is it's a main effect of this grouping. But there's no reason at all that we can't turn two knobs and we can turn one at a time or turn them both at the same time. One is up to now we've been talking about characteristics that in other settings we often call time invariant covariates. They are a characteristic of the individual that's independent of time. But we can also have covariates, and personally, I think this is where life gets really interesting. Mm-hmm. We can have covariates that vary with a function of time. When we have at time 2, did you drink to excess or not, yes or no, we also have a report of stress in the home in that time period. And we have that at time 3, but that stress in the home may have changed. What we do is we can build in these time-varying covariates and then expand it where either one of the predictors interacts with time, and it brings us into our usual it depends.
Wow.
Then those hazards are no longer proportional, meaning that they're held equitable over the timeline. But imagine that a child who has a substance use disordered parent is at risk for earlier onset of use, but that it is delayed in adolescents who have a parent who does not suffer from a substance use disorder. And so it depends. It interacts with. So those hazards are not proportional. They're unproportional. We'll just say they're improportional. The proportional hazards assumption is no longer in need of our services. But notice that all of this opens up this amazing set of questions.
Yeah.
Predicting time to event as a function of characteristics of the individual, as a function of characteristics of the individual at a given time point, and then either or both of those interacting with the passage of time. The reason that these haven't become almost universally used for a lot of questions in behavioral sciences is perplexing.
Our goal with today's episode was not to take you all the way down into the weeds of survival analysis, but just to raise awareness of this. There's this incredibly powerful tool out there for understanding how long it takes for something to occur, and we're just not availing ourselves of it. So we hope that by chatting with you about it a little bit today, that it will maybe start your brain percolating on some ways you might be able to incorporate this into some of the things that you are studying.
Even if you don't, to think more carefully about growth models and that the intercept of a trajectory is not the onset, it's not the beginning, it's not the initial value. You came to the party halfway through and all of that process has been going on and you're trying to understand it when the party has been going on all night long and you're walking into the middle of it.
Yeah.
There are issues of, can you apply this to existing data? But the bigger one often is, could you design a study to capitalize on this? And there's so many interesting things to think about. Do you use a truly prospective design or do you use retrospective reports? There are a lot of limitations to that, but sometimes you can sit down with somebody with a calendar and say, all right, think about last birthday. Where were you on your birthday? What did you do on your birthday? survey, and you get a retrospective reporting. You can have experimental designs where you assign people to conditions. You can do observational. You can look at a new onset of a behavior, or you can look at one that is recurring. So in a 6-month period, did you get drunk to excess? Yes or no, but that can be a recurring behavior. Is time on a continuum or is it discrete? What is your beginning in time? What is your 0 point? What is your metric? How long do you follow? Think about having a clean sheet design where you can go to NIH for support to really tackle what are risk and protective factors of the age of onset of alcohol use. It's fascinating.
I hesitated to do this, but I have this chart that I'm keeping every time we record. I'm going to show it to you. I don't know if you can see it. Can you read what that says?
It says Patrick's P chart, and it's a step function of minutes of recording to when I need to say, so we're done here. You would think it's because of the topical area and that we've covered and we have the length that we want or the depth that we want, but it really is, I have to go to the bathroom. We hope this gives you something to think about in your own work. Can you recast your research question when you don't just think about is somebody drinking or not?
Right.
But the classic line from Willett and Singer is moving from whether an event has occurred to when an event has occurred. We will put on show notes, readings, some websites, some other resources. But let's work of bringing that 1991 article, introducing this to the social sciences into work that we do more regularly.
Thanks very much, everybody. Patrick, I no longer need your services.
That's because you have a Snapple bottle.
Thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to tell your friends to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they go for something to make them feel like... You can also follow us on X, Twitter, and Blue Sky, or is it Bluesky? And visit our website, quantitudepod.org, where you can leave us a message, find organized playlists and show notes and syllabi, search for past episodes, and other fun stuff. And finally, check out our cool Quantitude merch, like shirts, mugs, stickers, and spiral notebooks from redbubble.com, where all proceeds from non-bootleg authorized merch go to donorschoose.org to help support low-income schools. You've been listening to Quantitude, the podcast that somehow you've managed to survive for nearly 150 episodes. Thank you. Today's episode has been sponsored by Disproportional Hazards, like how the effect of being a terrible teacher on the odds of being able to survive in academia is much more negative before tenure than it is after tenure, where it seems to have no effect whatsoever. And by left censoring, like when you already pretty much understand the material for a class lecture because you did the assigned readings as asked, but have to sit through the professor explaining it anyway because the rest of the class never does. And finally by right censoring, sort of like what you do to us when you don't listen all the way to the end of the episode. But not today. This is most definitely not NPR. Because she's dead.
You're goddamn right.